We are getting to know African creation myths this month on the Mythological Africans podcast. As we talked about before, there are 5 broad themes into which creation myths are generally classified. There's ex nihilo creation out of nothing. There's creation by emergence, in which all that exists emerges from under the earth, from a cave, or from a body of water. There is creation by world parent, in which all that is born, like most humans and animals are, out of the union of 2 entities, one male and the other female. There's creation from the cosmic egg, in which all that exists emerges from an egg. And there's creation by earth divers, in which a cosmic entity dives into the primordial waters and secures a portion of land that eventually becomes earth. Sometimes one creation myth encompasses several types of creation themes. For example, we saw last week that a version of the creation myth of Sierra Leone's Mende people starts with Ngewo, the creator, making the world out of nothing, and making animals and humans, and then putting them in a cave, only allowing them to emerge after a series of destabilizing events. So we start with ex nihilo, and then we have an emergence type of creation event. Something else that happens is that there can be more than one version of the same creation myth or folkloric account. And these variations, especially when they have cosmological implications, can be the source of confusion. And so in this episode of the Mythological Africans podcast, we take a break from stories to put some context around the variations that you will see in mythological and folkloric accounts. Hello friends, and welcome to the Mythological Africans podcast, where we read and talk about stories from African mythology and folklore. I am your host, Helen Tunde. There is another version of the Mende creation myth which doesn't mention a cave. I summarized this version in last week's episode, so if you want to know more, you can listen to that episode or buy my book, because I have that story in there and an analysis of the story as well. The Sona creation myth, another example of an emergence creation myth which we looked at last week, also has variations, and they are very interesting. For example, in the version we encountered last week, the first created man is called Matsieng. In other versions, he's called Loe. Both Matsieng and Loe are used interchangeably in different versions of this myth. In some accounts, the name Loe refers to both the cave that the created beings were put in and the first created one-legged human. In other accounts, Matsieng is the cave and Loe is the one-legged human. There are accounts in which one-legged Matsieng is a servant to a god called Loe, and it is Loe who made the whole and made the first creatures. In other accounts, Loe is an ancestor of the Batswana, so the Tswana people, while others hold that Matsieng is the ancestor of the Batswana. Yet other accounts involve Loe, Matsieng, and other figures, heroes, and fantastical creatures, each of whom are associated with specific geographical locations and different lineages or clan groupings amongst the Tswana. Now, if you were raised Christian like me, your head is probably exploding at the thought that there is more than one version of a creation myth, because in the Christian worldview, the Genesis account, which starts with the creation of the wider world in chapter 1 and then focuses on Adam and Eve in chapter 2 and 3, is it. But even the Christian biblical canon as we know it was compiled and legitimized over almost 1,000 years, and after a great many meetings or councils as they were known. The major meetings include the Council of Rome, which held about 382 AD, and then there was the Council of Hippo, the Council of Carthage, the Council of Florence, and finally the Council of Trent, which held in the year 1546 AD. So it took almost 1,000 years for the Christian church to decide on its version of what is canon, and even then that decision is debated. As some of you may know, I come from a Catholic family, but I went to a Baptist school for most of my teenage years. So growing up, I read the Catholic Bible, which recognizes 73 books, 46 in the Old Testament and 27 in the New. So my conception of the Bible included, the book of the Maccabees, the story of Susanna, Bel and the Dragon, the book of Judith, the book of Tobias, and many others. So imagine my surprise when I went to a Baptist school and found out that those books were actually not supposed to be part of the Bible. And it was definitely some shade throwing from each side. The Catholics saying, the Protestants don't have the fullness of the Word of God. And the Protestants saying, well, the Catholics included demonic and other such accounts in their Bible. And if you look at spiritual traditions or folkloric or mythical traditions with documented accounts of cosmological and other events, there are variations that exist, both legitimate and illegitimate. Some are canon and some are relegated to the arena of just folklore stories. And some have been actively erased from the discourse, especially if they contradict or threaten what the orthodoxy of the time had decided is or should be the truth. For example, earlier this year, I did a bit of deep reading on the tantric traditions from India. And what really came through is that without the work of a man called Abhinavagupta, who is recognized as one of the most important thinkers and mystics of the tantric tradition, we wouldn't have the synergy that exists between different branches of tantric beliefs and practices today. Because in his writings, his his biggest book, I think it's called the Tantra Loka, he actively and rigorously sought to make connections and explain differences between the different branches of the tantric path, the different schools of thought, the different stories, the different teachers. And he almost single-handedly forged the tantric belief system into a semblance of a unified whole, which is quite the feat. So a few things to keep in mind here, friends. First, variations in mythical, cosmological, and folkloric accounts are more the norm than not. And this is mainly because the orality of these traditions left room for improvisation and adaptation, as long as the general outline and ultimate outcomes of the stories remain the same. Additionally, as we've talked about before, stories could change if the circumstances warrant those changes. A clear example of this is the Balinyonga creation myth, which we discussed in the first episode. And in this myth, the arrival of Europeans clearly changed the way that story was told, added aspects to it that perhaps more than likely were not there before Europeans showed up. And then there is a condition under which many of these stories were documented. In some cases, the person documented the stories sought out the official storytellers of the community or witnessed public performances put on by professionals or experts. And there are cases such as with the reciters of Rwandan historical poetry, where there is a vested interest in accuracy and authenticity. So you have to recite the poem, usually with lineages and important historical aspects of the community, word for word as you were told. And my understanding is that you memorize it, you tell it. There's no theatrics, so it's not the typical African performance where you would act out what the story you were telling. You were just expected to tell the story as you remember being taught. And so people who witnessed such performances or spoke to such people more than likely documented versions which were much closer to the orthodox versions than what a random person from the village might have provided. Examples of this include Senegalese diplomat, poet, and folklorist Berago Diop, who documented a lot of Wolof legends and folktales, but collected these stories from his family's griot, Amadou Kumba. And if you know anything about griot culture in West Africa, these were highly skilled storytellers who were expected to remember the lineages and histories of the families that they were associated with. Similarly, Marcel Griot, the French anthropologist who documented the cosmological accounts of the Dogon, also another West African people, worked closely with a man called Ogo Temeli, who was a hunter, a diviner, and an elder to the Dogon, a Hogon as it's called. And, hunter, diviner, and elder, these are basically the triple stars of people who are known to be cultural memory keepers, if you want to call it that. And so speaking to someone like that, you're more than likely going to get versions of whatever account you're looking for that's close to the official account, or what would be the official account in that context. And another example is Germain Detelin, an associate of Marcel Griot, who worked and recorded the creation account of Mali's Mande people. And he worked closely with elders, with performers, and the people who would know the official quote-unquote versions of these stories. But then there are other cases where the people documenting these stories spoke to ordinary people, sat in on family storytelling sessions, listened as people talked in markets, in farms, and as you can imagine, these versions will perhaps not be as close to orthodox versions as others, depending on who you asked. And then there is the fact that stories are documented at different points in time. Think about it. The version of a creation myth documented in the 1600s or the 1700s, when Christianity had not yet penetrated a community on the continent, might look very different from a version documented in the 1920s, when mission schools had been established, people had converted, and things had changed quite radically. And similarly, a version of a story documented in a community which transformed under Islamic incursion that included trade, marriage alliances, and other subtle forms of influence might be a bit different from a version documented in the situation where the Islamic incursion was outright conquest. And another underlooked aspect of this variation issue is that different African communities were constantly learning and borrowing ideas and stories from each other. An example of this is the case of the Yoruba and the Fon, whose respective kingdoms, Oyo and Dahomey, were sometimes rivals and sometimes collaborators, and it's well documented that the cosmologies of these people have greatly influenced each other. For example, when the Dahomean king took wives from the Yoruba, many of these women ascended in palace hierarchy, eventually becoming important spiritual leaders who then integrated aspects of Yoruba cosmology into Fon cosmology, for better or worse. So what are we supposed to do with this information? Personally, I think it's a cause for just general relaxation. We can all just take a deep breath and relax. Mythology and folklore are a source of identity, and they can be a pathway to belonging and connection, even in fraught contexts like colonization or conquest. But the important thing is that we recognize that all the stories, even the ones we don't like, even the ones we know are artifacts of the jihadist, colonial, and missionary enterprise, have their place in the evolution of life on the continent. We can just take a deep breath, relax, and do the work of sorting through them to see what we want to keep and what we want to set aside. We'll stop here for the week, but please come back next week because we are going to do a deep dive into the Mande creation myth, which has some juicy chunks of different kinds of creation myth themes. Thank you as always for listening.